Now, to the start of the August bank holiday, the Friday night. Were you in Hessle, near Hull, on Humberside that evening? Or have you ever taken driving lessons in that part of the world? If so, was your instructor called Keith Slater? On the night of Friday the 26th of August, Keith answered a knock on the door of his home and someone stabbed him to death. Police hope this reconstruction will prompt people who've ever known Keith Slater to come forward and help with the inquiry. Just outside Hessle, there's a wooded area called Little Switzerland. On Friday morning, Keith and his family walked down there for a picnic.
Here we go. See, both go in the end. Very good, isn't it?
Keith had no driving lessons that morning because his car was in for service. But by lunchtime, he'd picked up his car and called into the driving school. He was self-employed and had been franchised to the school for the past 16 months. Keith was a keen rugby player who almost always wore his Hessle Rugby Club tie and sweater while at work.
Get yourself comfy. You both in. Make sure your mirrors are clean. That's lovely. Now, we just follow the road round. That's it, now careful. That's it. That's fine, he's got right away, he's coming first. That's smashing.
That evening at 8:30, Keith's wife Carol finished work. She just started a part-time job as a cashier. There was a sale on at home base and she'd had a difficult and busy evening.
I had to remember all those codes. I had to print on codes every time I came up with the stuff. Oh.
Just before 9, after a little bit of shopping, they arrived at their home on Bonaccord Road. The children were staying the night with their grandmother, so the two of them came back to an empty house.
But 18 months ago, Ted dropped his drawbridge for the last time and moved here to this...
After dinner, Keith and Carol spent a quiet evening watching television. But shortly after 10:30, Carol, who wasn't interested in the programme, went to bed.
I'm going up now, love.
An hour later, at 11:30, Keith went up too. At midnight, in Northgate, this pub barman was walking home.
Can you tell me the way to Bonaccord Road?
I don't know, sorry.
A few minutes later, at Andy Carr's Taxis, close to Hessle Square.
Alpha 18, 210 Buffet Road to the Silver Cod.
Can you give me directions to Bonaccord Road?
Yes, if you go to the top, turn left, follow the road down, and it's first on your right-hand side.
Is it past the Nolan pub?
No.
The witnesses described this man as stocky, with crew-cut hair, and in his 20s or early 30s. If it was you, please call us straight away to be eliminated from this inquiry.
Keith, is it the police?
The police?
Keith Slater.
Here.
Keith!
The screams were heard by a couple walking home a block away. They thought it was a party. The couple then saw a young man in a dark coat come out of Bonaccord Road. At 12:25, a man was sighted heading towards the footbridge which spans the railway line and Clive Sullivan Way. It's now 6 weeks since the murder, and police are still anxious to trace everyone who knew Keith Slater and those who learned to drive with him. In particular, they'd like to hear from one young woman. A blonde girl was seen with him several times between February and July at the National Pub on National Avenue in Hull. She was petite, described as stunning, and witnesses remember that she wore a good deal of gold jewellery. Was this you, or do you know who she was? She and Keith were also seen here in Cottingham. She was aged around 20, was smartly dressed, and may well have carried a briefcase. There's another woman detectives need to trace. On the day before the murder, a rugby friend of Keith's flashed his lights at Keith's car on First Lane, Anlaby. It was about 8:45 in the morning. Although Keith's diaries show no lessons booked for that time, a woman with fair or brownish hair was driving the car. Do you know who she was? Mr. Lilly, were those two different women or one and the same?
Well, the evidence is that the descriptions do differ somewhat, but really it is something we must keep an open mind on.
Now, there must be suspicions that Keith was having an affair with somebody whose boyfriend or husband didn't like it, or at least he suspected they were having an affair and took it out.
Yes, this is obviously an area that we've looked at. Inquiries have brought forth many useful lines, and that is one of them, yes.
Now, obviously, this woman or these women have done nothing wrong themselves. Obviously, if they don't come forward after an appeal, there'll be people who are bound to suspect that they're some sort of accessories to the murder. But you desperately need these women to come forward.
It really is imperative that these two women come forward. It is true to say that they have not committed any offence at this stage, but they really must come forward. I would urge also, of course, that if any relative or friend knows who these people are, then please come forward as soon as possible. It really is imperative that we trace these two people.
OK, now the man himself, who seems to have known something about the area, we've got quite a good description of him, haven't we?
Yes, we have an artist impression which was done by Keith Slater. Carol saw the assailant fighting with her husband as she came down the stairs, having heard the disturbance. And she made an artist impression as a result of that. What I would say, of course, is that that is exactly as Carol remembers him. I wouldn't feel for 1 minute that he has such starry eyes if he's sat at home now or indeed in a pub. But we must say that is as Carol remembers him in the heat of the moment.
Now, someone must have suspicions about a boyfriend, a husband, somebody they know who looks a bit like that. But one thing is that he must have got covered in blood that night.
Yes, Carol was covered in blood because Keith was bleeding quite profusely, and she was covered in blood as she helped him back in. The assailant must have been well covered in blood. What I would say is that there must be someone sitting at home who knows that someone came home during the early hours of Saturday the 27th of August, covered in blood, acting suspiciously. They must hold a question mark against such a person, and I would urge them, please contact us here or at the police station as soon as possible.
If you think you know who that man is, if you think you can help, if you think you know who those women are, if you knew Keith Slater and haven't yet contacted the police, and above all, if you know that woman or those women that were seen with him, please call us right away. 01811 8055, or call the incident room at Hull. That's on 501 222. That's 0482, the code for Hull, 501 222.
In this case, a code was left at the scene of crime that required cracking. It was quite amazing.
We had a mixture of sex, violence, witchcraft, and a victim that apparently didn't know the killer.
I suddenly realised how sinister things had been in my house.
19 years ago, just after midnight, Keith Slater and his wife Carol were asleep in bed.
I was asleep when I was suddenly awoken by the sound of 3 or 4 loud knocks. Keith went down to open the door.
Keith Slater?
I was startled and I immediately jumped out of bed. I then heard what I knew was the sound of a person struggling. No words were spoken. As I ran down, I saw that Keith was covered in blood over his left shoulder. I knew he had been stabbed.
35-year-old Keith Slater lived in Hessle, a small town on the outskirts of Hull. He was a driving instructor and keen rugby player. Teammates said he worked hard and played hard. His death was a total mystery.
When I got there, sadly Keith was dead. He was lying in the living room. And Carol, his wife, was there with Keith in the house, trying to come to terms with what happened. It was a blood-stained scene. There was blood all over the place, and clearly Keith had been viciously attacked. A picture emerged of the murderer walking through Hessle, looking for Bonnecord Road. During that journey, he'd asked a number of people for directions. When he ran away from the scene, he took a strange route as well. These things suggested to me that actually the killer didn't know Hessle that well, and therefore this was someone who had never been to Keith's house before.
I would describe the man as in his mid-20s, around 5'7" tall. He appeared stocky. He had very large, wide eyes which gave him a crazed look.
At every crime scene, we conduct house-to-house inquiries because we know these will reveal clues to us. In this case, neighbours saw the murderer run away from the scene, so we knew the escape route. We also knew that he'd gone over Ferry Road Bridge, and that's where we found the tissue.
On that tissue was Keith Slater's blood. The killer had discarded it as he fled from the scene. But 6 weeks into the inquiry, police had no suspects and no idea why Keith was killed.
We still hadn't made the link between the killer and Keith. We didn't know whether or not this was a random killing or that Keith was killed because of some other motive.
Let's take you back now to the start of the August bank holiday.
With so little to go on, Humberside Police made an appeal on Crimewatch.
What the Crimewatch programme did was allow us to put some pieces of that puzzle together, and all of a sudden a picture appeared.
200 miles away in Wallington, Surrey, a viewer became anxious at hearing Slater's name on Crimewatch. She couldn't wait to tell her son, Barry.
An instructor called Keith Slater.
The moment she mentioned Slater, a heavy feeling came in me. And I felt sick.
Keith answered a knock on the door of his home, and someone stabbed him to death.
There was a police station across the road from where I worked, and I walked in there and said I'd like to speak to somebody, re the Crimewatch programme and a murder in Hull.
A month before the murder, landlord Barry Williams had rented rooms to two brothers, Patrick and Martin Brown.
They were really like chalk and cheese. Patrick was very outgoing, vivacious, lively, but Martin was a quieter, calmer person altogether.
The brothers had an unusual friend called Joe Henry. He was a frequent visitor to the house, and the three would often disappear into the woods.
Joe Henry was a very forceful character. I was taught he was a gypsy, that he had some high rank in gypsy circles, that he knew all about shamanism. He had this world that he lived in. Sheer fantasy as far as I was concerned.
Conversations in the house between the brothers and Joe Henry revolved around one name.
The word Slater would crop up. Slater was described as an evil spirit or being. If anything went wrong in my house, something got broken, it was Slater's fault. One night, Patrick Brown turned round very coldly and said, "Slater's dead." And I thought, well, thank God for that. That's it, the story's dead. I never for 1 minute attach that name to a human being.
This account from landlord Barry Williams would prove crucial. It provided a link between the three men and Keith Slater. Keith's wife Carol had worked in the same old people's home as Joe Henry. They'd had a brief affair. Keith had found out and warned Joe off. This was clearly a significant line of inquiry. Joe Henry and the Brown brothers were all arrested and questioned. Joe and Patrick had cast iron alibis. Martin Brown didn't.
He said that he'd gone into London to buy some drugs to send to his brother, that he'd drunk alcohol, become drunk and fallen asleep in a park. He couldn't produce a witness to say where he was or what he was doing.
Police were baffled. Joe Henry seemed the obvious suspect because of his affair with Keith's wife, yet he had a watertight alibi. Martin Brown had no alibi, but why would he kill Keith Slater? Then, out of the blue, Martin Brown apparently confessed to his mother that he was the killer.
Martin's mum was a religious person, and this troubled her greatly, and she sought advice from a priest.
Martin's mum explained to the priest how she had confronted her son about the murder of Keith Slater. She wanted answers. Martin had apparently told her that he did it. Police were confident the confession would nail Martin Brown. It didn't. For legal reasons, it couldn't be used as evidence in a court of law. After 7 years, all meaningful lines of inquiry had been exhausted, and the investigation was scaled down.
I was always convinced that one day we would catch this man and bring him to justice. I just knew that if we kept working away, we'd get there.
"15 years after the murder, the case was reviewed. Detective Sergeant Phil Bell joined Colin and began working his way through all the evidence.
Initially, I wasn't aware of how big the task was. I think I read certainly in excess of 2,000 statements that were part of the original inquiry.
A fresh pair of eyes spotted a remarkable clue.
I was looking through a document folder. I'll never forget the document number. It was document number 141. And as I opened it up, I saw it was a photocopy of a matchbox that's been found about a mile away from the scene.
There were 2 rows of numbers written on the back of the matchbox.
And I remember commenting to a girl in the office. I said, what's Martin Brown's date of birth? And she said, 18th of February 1964. And I said, bloody hell, I've found a matchbox here that's got Martin Brown's date of birth on.
The second row of numbers was the date of the murder, the 26th of August, 1988.
It also had a number, when I looked on the side, the photocopy, it had a number 32, which was Keith Slater's house number. I thought, this is so important. It's never been brought to anybody's attention before. It was fantastic. It was an absolutely brilliant feeling.
To learn more about what these numbers meant, detectives approached Dr. Richard Hoskins, an expert in numerology.
For a person who's into numerology, it will dictate everything they do. And the most fundamental date in numerology is the birth date of a person that's produced or worked out into a single number. Now, in the case of Martin Brown, his birth date, 18th of February 1964, when you add those digits together, as he had done on the matchbox, it produced 31. 3 plus 1, 4. And he lived his life by that number. That number 4 indicates a person of great determination, will, who wants to go ahead and do whatever he wants in life. I think he thought he was under some kind of protection from the occult, that he was empowered through the actual writing of it. He'd done it in code. He'd never be busted. He was wrong.
This matchbox found near to the murder scene was compelling evidence, but police needed more. It was Joanne Ashworth's job to assess all the original scientific evidence. She focused on the blood-stained tissue discarded by the killer.
We could imagine that the offender, as he's running away from the scene, looking around for something to wipe blood from his hands, pulls out a tissue from his pocket, wipes his hands and either drops it or discards it. Straight away, possibilities of DNA from the offender exist.
But the forensic team ran into a huge problem.
At the original examination, we were told that the tissue was in very bad condition. Obviously, it had been stored over the years and was very, very fragile.
There was a real chance the tissue would reveal nothing.
We did insist that we had some DNA tests carried out, and the first pass we had a negative result. The tissue was revisited. Again, more negative results. Again, disappointment.
After 2 years, the forensic team had found nothing. They were close to giving up. But then a scientific breakthrough offered a glimmer of hope.
I tested 10 different areas of the toilet tissue using a newer technique, what we call low copy number DNA. If you just touch an item, you leave trace amounts of your DNA behind. And low copy number is sensitive enough to pick up that DNA.
After a third and final attempt, the team at last had a breakthrough.
We achieved a full DNA profile from a male individual who wasn't the deceased. So we thought, good chance that this DNA could be from our offender.
The profile was entered into the National DNA database, but no match was found. It was now Phil's job to identify who that profile belonged to. It was a priority to compare the DNA sample with that of prime suspect Martin Brown. But obtaining a DNA sample wasn't going to be easy. Brown was now living in Australia.
As a consequence of that, I had to approach his family members to try and obtain a paternal or maternal DNA link, which would then prove that the DNA on the tissue was related to the Brown family. His father agreed to provide a sample.
This sample from Norman Brown proved the DNA on the tissue was from one of his 4 sons. 3 were quickly eliminated, and that left 1. Martin Brown.
I would describe a murder inquiry as doing a jigsaw puzzle. What you try and do is establish a picture of what the murder's all about. All of a sudden, you saw a clear picture of what it was, and that picture was Martin Brown. We now knew that we were on the track of the killer.
Phil got his number in Australia and gave him a call.
Hello.
Hello there, is that Martin?
It is.
Martin, it's DS Phil Bell from Humberside, and we're reinvestigating the Keith Slater murder.
To receive a telephone call asking about a murder inquiry from 1988, I'm sure he'd be absolutely flabbergasted. It was something that he would have thought was well in the past.
The reason we're reinvestigating the murder is that we have obtained a DNA profile which we are trying to find the source. And I've got to ask you whether you consent to provide a DNA sample.
I understand your concern with this Keith Slater murder, but
Yeah.
why should I be concerned?
Well, you could do that.
I'll think about it. That's all I can say at this stage.
And what about coming across to this country to be interviewed about it?
I don't think so, mister.
Okay. If we came across to Australia, would you be amenable to be interviewed across there?
I think I'll do as best I can, like.
Right, okay. I take it that's a no then, is it?
Well, not just to suit you bastards, no.
After 18 years, it was time for Martin's past to catch up with him. Last October, detectives flew to Australia to arrest him and bring him home.
Martin lived in a small village near the mountains in southern Australia. Quite an idyllic area to live in. He was obviously married and he had 2 teenage sons. He worked as a part-time TV repairman and part-time electrician. He had a nice, comfortable lifestyle.
People believe all sorts of things. What's extraordinary is that in an obsessive type of character, it seems that it can take over a person's life. In Martin Brown's case, it was numerology that just consumed him, took over his whole being. He wanted to live his whole life by it. The murder of another human being happened because he thought he was obeying and following the rules of numerology.
Having flown halfway around the world, detectives had caught the killer.
When I finally met him in Australia, it was a sense of immense professional pride that finally we'd got the man.
To look him in the eyes and arrest him for the murder of Keith Slater was quite a moment, really. And as soon as I looked him in the eyes, I knew that it was him. There was no doubt, and he knew that I knew it was him.
In court, Martin Brown pleaded not guilty, but the evidence proved otherwise. The judge said the motive for the murder may never be known, and even Brown himself may not have the answer. Martin Brown was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.